So as I said, I'm going to talk through some tips and considerations around interdisciplinarity and writing. These are based on my own experiences and some sessions that we've run at the IRN. So first off is to sort of ask yourself the question of what is the purpose of your interdisciplinary thesis? Who are you writing it for and what do they expect? So you might have a few different thoughts on this immediately, that maybe you're writing it for yourself, you're writing it for the disciplines that you're working in, for your supervisors. But one of the pieces of advice that I've been given on this, and arguably relevant for all PhDs, is that ultimately you're writing your thesis for your examiner. So when you're towards the later stages of the PhD, you need to really start thinking about the kind of disciplinary positionality where your examiner might sit. So for example, although I'm based in sociology and heritage studies, and that's my supervisory team, my examiner is actually a geographer by background. So in my writing, I'm having to think about, will this be accessible to somebody that's not necessarily read the same types of sociological literature, and kind of bearing that in mind towards the later stages. And there's also sort of different writing styles that you might want to do across the thesis, depending on the disciplines that you're working in. So most social science PhDs tend to go from literature review to methods, and then through to kind of findings chapters. But you can write other sorts of formats for a PhD, and one of the things that I was always interested in was writing the PhD a little bit differently. So it's worth bearing in mind that there might be different formats that work better for the type of work that you're doing. As well as a thesis, you might also want to write other different kinds of outputs, publications, policy briefings, and again, writing styles can differ in these. Although there's certain disciplinary expectations that you might have in your field, with an interdisciplinary PhD, you might want to actively try to transcend some of those conventions. And so I think a really key message that I've had over the last few years is that there isn't really a single or correct way to do interdisciplinarity with your writing. And so really it's about what fits best for the type of research that you're doing and also for the audience. So constantly thinking about, how will this piece of writing be read by someone else? Also, in terms of communication of research, one of my sort of lessons I've learned is that sometimes if you're trying to communicate something, you might actually be using sort of visuals or other types of aids that can be potentially more powerful than words or could complement your writing. So I've spent quite a lot of time in the later stages of the PhD coming up with kind of bespoke diagrams and using images to try to convey some of what is quite challenging to convey through words. So we're going to talk later in a group about the kind of literature review and publications, and there's some kind of questions that might help to frame some of your thinking around this. Again, some of these questions are potentially relevant to all PhDs, but then it's potentially more important if you're interdisciplinary to try and reflect on these a bit more deeply. You potentially have significantly more choices as well when you're thinking about these questions. So the questions are, who are the most important researchers and theorists in the topic areas that you're writing in? How are they relevant to your research? Where and how do the topics you're working with arise? Why are they important? Is there more than one discipline that you're combining together with another? And if so, can you outline the importance of each of these disciplines and indicate clearly why there's an advantage to linking them together? So those are some kind of broader questions that you should be really thinking about in a PhD generally, and in each specific piece of writing that you do in the different formats. So following on from this kind of broader question, we do have a kind of selection of practical writing tips that we've accumulated over the years. I think I'm going to ask Wendy just to run through these briefly.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Zoe. So yeah, these are some of the tips that, is that the first, did you go forward one screen? Can you go back? Yeah, perfect. So these are some of the tips that I've accumulated through the year and that we've accumulated through the years, and that we discuss as a network in terms of interdisciplinary writing and some of the kind of key practical tips that we can use. So the first one is really that you can never be too clear. particularly with the reasons why you're using a particular method. So if you're writing for an interdisciplinary audience, then it's really important to be very clear about why you're doing certain things, why you're using certain methods, why those methods are appropriate for what you're trying to convey and the work that you're doing. You really have to think that even if you're an interdisciplinary researcher, that potentially the people that you're either presenting to or writing for are not interdisciplinary, so they really need to have an understanding of why your work is combining methods or combining disciplines or theoretical approaches or whatever. So just having that real clarity within your own self and your own understanding can be really helpful when you're actually going to write. Moving on from this, writing clearly and presenting logically, Zoe's sort of just mentioned this in terms of potentially using visual or infographics can be really helpful to show what you did and how you did it. Sometimes when if you're presenting to an audience that are not interdisciplinary, or you're speaking to people who are not or don't have much experience within the field that you're working in, then having this infographic can be really helpful. I think if we all think about when we've read things that we're not entirely clear about, sometimes having that visual understanding can really aid in your thinking of what's going on. And then thirdly, know your strengths and understandings and ask if you don't understand or are not sure. I think that this is maybe something that people get better at, but particularly when you're starting your PhD, I think that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to know things, and this idea of imposter syndrome can really weigh heavily on you. And I think part of breaking that down is just understanding that everyone asks questions, and that if you don't understand or if you need clarification about a new, particularly about a new discipline, then it's okay to ask. If we're coming in to do interdisciplinary PhD, we will have a lot of gaps in knowledge. I know I certainly did, and I went to heaps of undergrad lectures just to kind of get an understanding, like a basic understanding of some of the fields that I was now working in. And then fourthly, check if concepts and terms are understood in the same way for everyone. So I've just used an example of my PhD here because I was looking at green space and urban green space. And what I actually found across the research is that even the term urban can mean different things in the natural sciences compared to the social sciences. So just be aware that even terms that you think that you understand or that have only one definition, actually that might not be the case, and that it's really helpful to just ensure that concepts and terms are actually the same across disciplines. And if they're not, then just ensure that you're using a definition, or you're providing a definition at the start of your work. And then don't make assumptions about what your audience will know, especially with acronyms. And this is something that I'm quite passionate about, because I know that I certainly went to a lot of meetings, I think we all have, where people use acronyms and have no idea what they mean. And when you're working in a field for so long and you become so used to using certain acronyms, then you forget that other people don't know what they are. So make sure that you've got an acronym list in the writing that you're doing, whether that's a journal article, your thesis, whatever you're doing. But do ensure that you're defining that, and when you're presenting or when you're just in conversations, just keep that in the back of your mind, that actually acronyms can sometimes hinder communication quite a lot, even if you think that it's obvious what they are. And then the last point on this slide is choose journals or conferences that fit your research objectives. So for example, an interdisciplinary journal. So the interdisciplinary journals that I've published in, they specify that in the scope of the journal. They say that they're looking for interdisciplinary papers. And that can be really helpful to ensure that you're not wasting your time going for journals that maybe their title or the name of the journal sounds that they would fit your research, but don't necessarily look for interdisciplinary work. So that's a really helpful tip. And yeah, like Zoe was saying, just think about who you want to see your research. So think about who your main audiences are. So with your thesis, it's obviously your examiners, but if you're writing a journal article, think about what professionals you want to see your work. Researchers in what field? What are the kind of leading journals in that field? And that could kind of guide you in deciding what journals that you want to publish in. Next slide, please. So yeah, following on from that tip about journal articles, it's possible that because if you're covering more disciplines than one, so if it's an interdisciplinary paper, then it's likely that your paper could be longer. So just ensure that you account for this in the word count limits of the journal. So all journals will tell you what their maximum word count is, or some of them don't have maximum word counts, but most of them do. So just be aware that often if you're trying to cover a lot of ground, that you'll be required to give more definitions, you'll be required to kind of give a little bit more information. So so it's likely that your paper will be a little bit longer. I know mine certainly was. So basing it on my previous experience. And then collaborate where possible, and if possible, get expert input. So if you're working on a paper, then it's quite likely that you're going to be working on that with people who are already writing in interdisciplinary ways or have experience with interdisciplinary work. If not, it's a really good idea to get somebody to read over your work just to ensure that that it's making sense. And then keep practicing with writing for different audiences. So one of the ways in which the IRN, or the Interdisciplinary Research Network, supports each other and supports the students that are in the network is that we present our work during lunchtime seminars, or we can send work over to other members just to see if they understand it. So for example, I've presented my work, and people in the network who have no experience in the research field that I'm in can watch my presentation and then have questions afterwards, and I can then sort of gauge if the level of understanding is there, if I've explained it well, if if sort of the way that I've integrated interdisciplinary working is has been successful. And I find that it's really good to do that in a supportive atmosphere, so like this network, rather than in more formal settings like conferences or to your supervisors or to sort of research groups. It can be quite nice to have a safe space to do that before you're going on to more formal settings. And then I guess a little bit linked to this, always get feedback on your writing or your presenting, whatever. So I've drawn on supervisors here, but of course it can be feedback from anywhere. But just making sure that they understand it, but again, just being aware that sometimes supervisors are based in their own disciplines, not necessarily interdisciplinary supervisors. So just be aware that with edits that they're giving, that it doesn't pull towards one discipline or another, unless that's what you're wanting to do. If you have a predominant discipline, that's fine, but just be aware that sometimes the edits and the tips that people reading it can give can actually be detrimental to interdisciplinary working. So just something to keep in mind. And then finally, just be aware that the library is there to help you, and other resources as well. So for example, when I wrote my literature review and then wrote another review paper, I went and spoke to the faculty librarian and explained that it was an interdisciplinary paper, but I wasn't sure of the libraries and the sources that I could use to actually find papers in the natural sciences, because I was so used to searching within the kind of social science literature base or evidence base that I wasn't sure the best way of making sure that that I was actually finding all the papers. So they were really, really helpful in helping me with the search strings and with search terms, and just providing me with resources about where to look and which databases provided this kind of interdisciplinary scope. So yeah, if you haven't already, then I would recommend going and speaking to your librarian or going to speak to the library and just finding out what resources and help is actually available for interdisciplinary researchers, because sometimes I don't think that that's communicated in inductions or within faculty. So yeah, that's my practical tips of writing and how to kind of get the best out of your interdisciplinary skills and interdisciplinary writing. So I'll pass back over to Zoe to start talking a little bit about examples of writing and some more skills in that area.
Thanks, Wendy. So obviously earlier I said, there's no singular or right way to kind of do this, to do interdisciplinary writing and communicating, but obviously that's not that helpful if you're thinking, how can I then learn what good practice looks like? So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to sort of allude towards what might be kind of better or worse examples of interdisciplinary writing. So there's three categories here that are potentially not so great approaches to interdisciplinary writing. We've got the sort of encyclopedic approach, which is to sort of kind of run through each discipline one after the other without really drawing any connections between the knowledge. Sections might be written from different perspectives, and there's not really anything to draw this information together. And so really to be interdisciplinary, there needs to be links, connections between the writing. The second one, the idea of contextualized writing. So you'd have a sort of dominant discipline and brief inclusion of other kinds of information or methods from a separate discipline, but again, there would really not be much connection between the two. Then you've got a kind of composite approach where you might be approaching a topic from different disciplines that might share certain themes, methodology, but rather than being multidisciplinary, in order for it to be interdisciplinary, there has to be some sort of discussion about disciplines affecting each other's findings. Again, that connection between disciplines. And so thinking through things like how would a natural science versus a social science approach to these findings differ. These are sort of categories, I guess, to think about when you're sort of looking at your own writing. They're not categories that I was aware of until quite recently, and I think I've probably been guilty of probably each of these in different contexts. And so actually writing in a way that is interdisciplinary is really challenging, especially when you want to cover certain, if you've got a large amount of topics you want to cover, it can be easy to fall into this kind of encyclopedic approach where you're sort of trying to get through all the topics, but then you don't leave yourself enough space to do that integrative work. So examples of potentially better writing, this is obviously subject to interpretation and disciplinary conventions and whatnot, but these are examples. I've put a link in the chat there to the Google Doc. So myself and Wendy have compiled some examples of writing that we've done and which sort of address interdisciplinarity. And so I thought it would be useful to share these with you so that you can kind of have a look through them, have a read, reflect on your own thesis and other kinds of writing that you might be doing, and think about how you might learn from or even avoid some of the mistakes of the examples in the Google Doc. And really it's about practice. I won't say practice makes perfect, because I think a piece of writing can always be rewritten and rewritten. And so practice makes almost perfect. And so really you just want to get to the stage where you've done enough rewriting and editing that you feel happy with what you're trying to communicate in that piece of writing. So just a couple of things from my own experience of doing this is that, as Wendy said, you often need to unpack particular concepts. So a lot of feedback that I got on my first full draft was in relation to particular concepts that I was using: deterritorialization, power, assemblage. These are all concepts that I was aware of and understood, but in the writing itself, I hadn't actually spent enough time to explain why these concepts were useful, what they actually meant. And so in order to make space for that kind of explanation and work, you do have to be quite selective in places about what you might want to include and exclude from your writing. And my experience is that you have to be quite harsh, especially towards the end, about cutting anything that actually doesn't add value to your argument. Hence the point there about really just try and draw on and include what helps you make a unique contribution and insight. I think one of my issues was just spending too long trying to explain what other people were saying and doing, and not giving myself enough space to articulate in detail what I was doing and why I was doing it. So just briefly before we stop and have a bit of a discussion about this, communicating is part of writing as well, but we can also think more broadly about how we would want to communicate our research findings to other stakeholders. We at the IRN had a session on communicating with policymakers at our symposium last year. And so there's a full recording of this workshop, and if this is something that's going to be relevant to your research, I would really encourage you to go and have a look on our website and watch that recording. But just a few of the tips and kind of questions that were covered are on the screen here. And I just want to flag up a couple of key points that I think are really worth thinking about. So although you might want to spend a lot of time and detail in your thesis and academic work doing a lot of this positioning that I was just talking about, so explaining how your disciplinary fields intersect, justifying a particular approach, creating a dialogue and connection between disciplines, generally speaking, policymakers aren't really interested in any of that. They're not interested in interdisciplinarity in and of itself. They're more interested in the questions that your research answers and the problems that it can solve. So the speaker we had at this session even said, don't use the word interdisciplinarity because that can be off-putting and not even very helpful. So he suggested that research briefings are actually often boiled down to just 3 bullet points. So if all you have to communicate your research to other people is 3 bullet points, you need to really think about the crux of what it is that you want to communicate, knowing that your work will be reduced by others in that way. So definitely take a look at that resource if you're interested in communicating with policymakers. So I'll stop there for now, and hopefully that's given you some food for thought and we can have a bit of a discussion.